Welcome to Designer Digital's Biweekly Tip, October 4th, 2019. This week, 3 different ways to shadow chunky cuts grids in Photoshop and Elements. In this series of tips, we've been working with Katie Perteet's Cutting Files Chunky Cuts Grids. This set is part of the Cutting Files collection at Designer Digitals, but it's so much more. These grids can be used in digital scrapbooking and other digital projects. One question several of you have had about the grids is how to change the way the paper is attached to the grids. By adjusting the shadows, you can make the paper look like it's either glued to the grid or glued to the background paper, so you can get the look that you want to achieve. Here's how. Begin by referring to our video tip on filling the grids on the Designer Digitals blog. Create fill layers in Photoshop or Elements as demonstrated in the tip, and then decide how you want the paper to look. If you want the paper to look glued to the background with the grid sitting on top, you'll apply a shadow to the grid layer only. Now, if your grid is clipped to paper like mine is, be sure to apply the shadow to the grid layer, not the paper layer. This method is demonstrated in the How to Fill Chunky Cuts Grids video tip. Drop shadows are made by selecting a layer and using the Styles panel at the right side of the screen. So I'm going to select the grid layer, and then in the Styles I'm going to select a drop shadow to use. I like to use Katie Perteet's drop shadow styles to apply the shadows. I find that these shadows are much more realistic and more customized than the shadows that come preloaded in Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. And now you'll see that the grid looks like it's sitting on top of the paper and that the paper is actually glued to the background. Sometimes you may prefer to have the paper appear as though it's attached to the grid instead. And this is a little bit trickier to achieve since you'll want the shadow to show behind the grid, but you don't want it here in the intersections. The easiest way to get the look is to hide all of the layers except the grid. So first I'm going to delete the shadow that's on the grid layer, and then I'm going to hide any layer except for the grid or the grid fill layer. So I'm going to hide the background, and I'm going to hide the background paper. Now I can only see the grid and the grid fill sections. I hid the layers by clicking the layer visibility icon on the left side of the layer that I wanted to hide. It looks like a little eyeball. And when you click it and it's invisible, then that layer is also invisible. As a side note, if you're hiding a large number of layers, you can just click and drag downward to hide all the layers as you scroll down. Once the layers are hidden, click to select the top layer. So I'm going to scroll back up and select the top layer. Press Alt-Control-Shift-E, or on a Mac system, Option-Command-Shift-E on the keyboard. And this creates a new layer at the top, which is a composite of all of the visible layers. Apply a shadow to this layer. And now the papers and the photos that are in the grid appear to be part of the grid and not glued beneath it. But you still have your grid shadowed on your page. Let me go ahead and put the background paper back so that you can see the shadow a little bit more clearly. Perhaps you'd like a hybrid of these two methods where the paper looks like it's glued to the back of the grid, but then the entire filled grid is attached to the background. And you'll probably want the shadow on the paper to be smaller than the shadow on the outside edge of the grid, like it would be on an actual page. So to do this, we're going to apply a small shadow to the grid layer. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this composite, and I'm going to select the grid layer here and apply a small shadow. Now I can do this by double clicking the grid layer and bringing up the Layer Styles dialog box. I'm going to choose drop shadow, and then these are the settings that I used. I used multiply, and I used black as the color here. For the opacity, I chose 75%. I used global light, and then for the distance, I chose 4. Spread, I chose 3, and for the size, I put in 10 pixels. Now, this is just a jumping off place for you. You may or may not like the way that looks, and feel free to tweak that to get the look that you're going for. Continue by hiding all of the layers except for the grid and the grid fill and the paper layers. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this background, or hide the background paper. I'm not going to delete it. And that leaves me with just the grid that's already shadowed. Now I'm going to choose the top layer again and press Alt-Control-Shift-E. On a Mac system, again, that was Option-Command-Shift-E on the keyboard. That made a composite at the top, and you can see that the composite has a little shadow inside, so it looks like the paper is just glued to the very back side of the grid. Now you can attach a larger shadow to the composite layer that populates at the top of the layers panel. So it populated here, and I can apply a shadow to that. You can adjust the shadow distance and size until you're happy with the way the grid composite is shadowed against the background, but this one works for me. Now you can go in and hide all of the layers underneath the grid if you'd like, since you have a composite at the top, and then restore the visibility of the background paper. Using this method, your shadows are more realistic and you can get the effect that you want using the grids. Thanks so much for watching this week's video, and be sure to check back in 2 weeks for another Designer Digitals tip.